This keyboard right here, the Wooting HE, comes in at over $300 the way I have it spec'd here. And for the same money you could also pick up 3 or even 4 of these keyboards right here, and you'd probably even have some change left. Sure, this is a Wooting and pretty much the benchmark when it comes to Hall of Fame keyboards. But yeah, this coiled cable alone costs roughly 50 bucks. It's a good coiled cable, but that's about the starting price of this keyboard right here, fully built with keycaps and switches. So can any of these cheap keyboards even be good at that price point? I mean, I don't expect any of these to even come close to a fully loaded Wooting HE in terms of quality, software or latency, but yeah, these are marketed with a lot of the same features that the HE has. Most of these are supposed to have 8K polling, web-based utilities, and support for rapid trigger and SOCD. And of course, the marketing promises ultra low latency too, and we're definitely gonna test if any of these keyboards can even come close to the latency of the HE. Okay, let's start with the two most affordable keyboards of the bunch. This one here, the MCHOSE Ace 60 Pro, can be had for just $44 US, which is kinda crazy for a Hall of Fame keyboard. It even looks like they had less expensive versions available at some point. I have international links for all the keyboards in the video description, by the way, if you want to check prices, availability or buy something. And I really hope that the prices of these keyboards aren't gonna rise after I publish this video, because some of these are actually really good keyboards for the money. The version of the A60 Pro that I have here supposedly has better switches than the cheaper variants. This has the most expensive switches they offer, and it comes in at $69, which still is very affordable for an HE keyboard. The Womier M68 HE V2 comes in at about $60, so these two are pretty comparable. And you know, the spec sheets of these two keyboards kinda sound too good to be true. These are supposed to have 8K polling, web-based utilities, and all the important features like rapid trigger, of course, but also some of the more advanced features like SOCD and DKS. And yeah, at this price, I was fully expecting these to be a sham basically, but actually, most of what they claim is true. Let's start with the polling rate. 8K advertised, and both actually poll at 8 kHz. The Womier doesn't show the cleanest results, but it still causes proper 8K polling. And the A60 Pro actually pulls off very clean 8K polling, which is impressive for a keyboard that starts at under $50. What's even more impressive is the latency of the MCHOSE keyboard. Now, the Womier doesn't score a terrible result, 5 milliseconds is still decent, especially for a budget keyboard, but the A60 Pro really surprised me. 1.3 milliseconds is way closer to the Wooting HE than I expected. I also prefer the MCHOSE web utility over Womier's solution. Both are pretty basic and surely not the most polished utilities out there, but at this price point it's great to even get web-based software in the first place. And both utilities get the job done, but the MCHOSE utility is a bit more user-friendly and it's easy to see why. Compare this to Wooting's Utility V4 and you find a lot of similarities. From the general layout and navigation to how the individual settings are named. They even copied the symbols for SOCD and such. I guess Wooting are probably not too stoked about that, but you know, it's a good interface, you can't argue with that. And apart from a few little bugs, it's pretty functional too. I'm very happy to see that the profiles work and actually store the settings, which unfortunately cannot be taken for granted. For some reason though, the RGB settings often change when switching profiles, which is slightly annoying. And SOCD is pretty buggy right now, it randomly changes keybinds, which makes it practically unusable. I really hope that MCHOSE can fix this with a firmware update. But the essential settings, rapid trigger most importantly, work as they should. That can not be said about Womier's keyboard unfortunately. It only supports so-called continuous rapid trigger, and that's not ideal. Let's set the actuation point to the deepest setting for demonstration purposes. I now have to almost bottom out the switch to engage it, just like you would expect. And when I release the key ever so slightly, rapid trigger kicks in and deactivates the key press. So far so good. But watch what happens when I press back in the key ever so slightly, far above the actual actuation point. It triggers again, and that's clearly not 3.3 millimeters in. I now have to fully release the key to reset it, so that it doesn't trigger again above the actuation point. And that's really not how you want rapid trigger to work. So this is another point for the MCHOSE A60 Pro. It also has the better build quality, and I prefer how it sounds. The M68 sounds a bit hollow, just like your typical budget keyboard, and it really feels like it too. Nothing wrong about that for a $60 keyboard, but the A60 Pro feels a lot more solid. It's entirely made out of plastic too, but it's a higher quality material that feels a lot more sturdy. And that definitely helps with the sound too. I have longer sound samples for all the keyboards at the end of the video, by the way. Now, the A60 Pro is quite impressive for the price, but what do you get when you spend a bit more money? These two can be had around the $90 mark. This one is from DrunkDeer, which is pretty much the OG of affordable Wooting alternatives. Definitely one of the first brands to bring affordable HE keyboards into the Western market. The other one is from YUNZII, a well-known brand in the budget mechanical keyboard segment. Safe to say I had high hopes for these two, but I gotta say I'm a bit disappointed, to be honest. Let's start with the YUNZII RT75. There are a few things I don't like about this keyboard. It's supposed to have web-based utility, but yeah, you need to install a driver to use it, which kind of defeats the purpose. Also, this interface might look familiar, as a lot of brands use it for their HE keyboard. For some reason though, it only allows for continuous rapid trigger, which is a huge drawback. And yeah, the interface itself, it's just terrible. I don't even want to go over every bug and everything that is wrong with this piece of software. It is a lot. At this point, I really just can't recommend this keyboard. There's nothing wrong with the keyboard hardware itself, but the firmware and software just make this a hard pass. Most of the other keyboards on this table are just better. Now to the DrunkDeer G60. I don't mind using this keyboard, but I'm not too impressed with the value proposition really. Let's talk about the good stuff first. It has a proper functional web utility, and rapid trigger is fully functional too. None of that continuous rapid trigger nonsense. And the G60 achieves true 1K polling, just as advertised. And it also has working profiles, which is super important, as you definitely need a profile for typing and a profile for gaming at the bare minimum. So it's got a lot of the most important basics covered. But yeah, it comes in at roughly $90, which is a lot to ask for a keyboard with this build quality and material selection. It's actually very comparable to Womier's keyboard, which is about $30 cheaper. These boards even sound somewhat similar. The issue with the Womier keyboard is that it only supports continuous rapid trigger. If that wasn't the case, I'd probably recommend it over the G60, as it's a good bit less expensive and otherwise pretty comparable. But yeah, the MCHOSE A60 Pro also exists, which makes spending more money on the G60 even harder to justify. The A60 Pro has the higher quality case, it has a higher polling rate, the web utility is easier to use, and the latency of the A60 Pro is a good bit lower too. The only thing that the G60 does better than the A60 Pro is SOCD. On the A60 Pro, it's essentially unusable with the current firmware, but it's functional on the G60, for the most part. Because the turbo mode of the G60 actually conflicts with SOCD. The turbo mode only reduces the latency by 0.1 milliseconds, so it's not an issue really, as you can just turn off the turbo mode. But the interface actually allows you to turn the turbo mode on with active SOCD without indicating that this disables SOCD, so that's something to keep in mind. I don't think that SOCD alone could justify getting the G60 over the A60 Pro, especially as there's a good chance that MCHOSE are just gonna fix SOCD with a firmware update, and this otherwise just is the superior keyboard. So yeah, 4 keyboards in, and the cheapest still comes out on top. It might have a hard time against these keyboards though, because we're entering 3-figure territory. These 3 keyboards can be had in the $100 to $120 range typically, about twice the price of the A60 Pro. And the jump in build quality is very noticeable with these. At this price point, we're starting to see cases partially made from aluminum, or even full aluminum cases. The NuPhy Halo 65 HE has an aluminum top frame and an ABS base with a soft touch finish. And the other two, the MCHOSE V2 and the Luminkey M68 HE, come with full aluminum cases. And I have to say the build quality of all 3 of these keyboards is very impressive for the price. These definitely wipe the floor with the standard plastic case that the Wooting HE pre-built comes with, and that's about twice the price. Now, sound is always a bit subjective, but to my ears, the Halo 65 sounds the best out of these three. For a pre-built Hall of Fame keyboard at this price, I think the Halo 65 actually sounds amazing. So much for the hardware, but yeah, a nice case and sound signature aren't worth much if the software or the performance are bad. And we'll talk about the software in a bit, but when it comes to the performance aspect at least, fortunately all three of them are pretty good. All three support 8K polling, just as advertised, and the latency results are respectable too. Both the NuPhy and the Luminkey are around the 3 millisecond mark, which is perfectly fine, and the 80K scored an even better result of just 1.8 milliseconds, which is the second fastest result among these budget keyboards. Pretty wild that after all, the cheapest keyboard of the bunch has the lowest latency that comes closest to the 88G. Now these latency results should not be overrated though. I've been using these keyboards back to back, and personally, I'm not able to tell that, for instance, the Halo 65 has like 2 milliseconds of additional latency over the A60 Pro. These two feel equally responsive to me in game. What's really a lot more important is the software. Rapid Trigger has to be working properly, and changing settings need to be somewhat simpler too. I'm not gonna use a keyboard if changing the Rapid Trigger or actuation settings is a hassle. Like, this is really what Hall of Fame keyboards are all about. You want to customize and fine-tune the settings for each key, and that's why a good utility is so important. Now, unfortunately, the Mega 68 doesn't have a web-based utility. It's the only keyboard of these that requires a standalone piece of software. That's a bit unfortunate for sure, and on top of that, this is not the most user-friendly utility either. It has quite a few bugs. SOCD is pretty much unusable right now. The configured keys sometimes just stop working altogether, which is pretty annoying when you're in-game. And to make matters worse, the interface currently has a bug that doesn't even allow you to delete the settings for SOCD and such. And these aren't the only bugs. The good thing about the Mega 68 though is that this keyboard supports profile switching with a keyboard shortcut. So once you've gone through the hassle of configuring your typing and game profiles, you don't have to open up this utility ever again. At least not for switching profiles, which is a huge plus. In fact, there's even a bug right now that doesn't let you switch profiles in the app, so yeah, there's that. The ATK68 V2 on the other hand has a web utility, and a pretty good one at that. Simple layout, clean design, and I didn't encounter any major bugs. It does lack some polish here and there, but overall I like using this utility. Even SOCD works as it should. My biggest point of criticism definitely is the lack of keyboard shortcuts for profile switching. Though profiles do work properly, and opening up the browser to switch profiles isn't a huge hassle, but having a quick keyboard shortcut for this is just a lot nicer. And this is where the Halo 65 comes in. It has both a really nice web utility and the ability to switch profiles without needing to open up the software. It has this little toggle switch that allows you to quickly switch between 3 different profiles. That's pretty neat. And NuPhy also have done a great job with their web utility. It's almost as good as Wooting's really, which is a huge compliment. I'd even rank it above Keychron's utility, which previously was my second favorite. It's simple to use, the design is nice, and I didn't encounter a single bug so far. Only thing is, the advanced features like SOCD, ModTab and such are a bit hard to find at first. You have to right-click the keys you want to configure in the key bindings menu to access these settings. Took me a few minutes to figure that out. But yeah, that's nitpicking honestly. It's hard to believe how well-rounded this keyboard is for the price. The build quality, the typing sound, the software and the performance, it's hard to find any major flaws really. I also like the ATK68 V2 and the Luminkey Mega 68 HE. They're not as refined as the Halo 65, but getting full aluminum cases for just over $100 definitely has its appeal. If I had to decide between these, I'd slightly prefer the ATK, mainly because of the better software. The keyboard that really surprised me though is the MCHOSE Ace 60 Pro. I was hoping to find an affordable HE keyboard that I could recommend, but I didn't expect to find a keyboard around the $50 mark that is this good. If you look at some of the more expensive HE keyboards in the market, it's hard to believe that such an affordable HE keyboard has a decent web utility, proper 8K polling, and such a low latency. I hope that MCHOSE can iron out a few minor bugs and get SOCD working. That will make this an even better deal. But it's an insane keyboard for the money already. I'm now going to leave you with some sound samples for all the keyboards, and I've also thrown in a few more HE keyboards for comparison. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.